Hello and welcome to this webinar called The Story of Palestine. My name is Anas As-Salah. I'm a third generation Palestinian refugee originally from Haifa, occupied Palestine. I'm honored to have the opportunity to share part of my story with you this morning. So thank you for being here, and maybe through storytelling and shared understanding, we can honor the past and work toward a future rooted in justice, truth, and peace. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we are gathering, or I am situated in the land of the Sanish peoples, and I offer my deep gratitude to them and their ancestors who have cared for this land for countless generations. As a Palestinian refugee and a settler on these lands, I hold deep respect for the indigenous peoples here and carry the responsibility of honoring their lands and their histories. So, Palestine geographically is situated in the heart of what people call the Middle East. It's the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is the Mediterranean Sea, and Palestine is on the Eastern Mediterranean, bordered by Lebanon from the north, Syria and Jordan from the east, and then the Red Sea from the south, and Egypt from the west. Its area is 26,990 kilometers squared. Vancouver Island is 32,100 kilometers squared, so Vancouver Island is slightly larger than Palestine. And as of 2023, Palestine is inhabited by approximately 7.4 million settlers and 7.4 million indigenous Palestinians, with another approximately 7.4 million Palestinians living in diaspora. So, of course, when I say Palestine, I'm talking about occupied Palestine, from the river to the sea, and which is now the so-called State of Israel. So some pictures of Palestine. We see here Nasra or Nazareth. We see Jerusalem, and we see Jaffa or Jaffa. And this is Haifa, and this is Mount Hermon, Jabal al-Sheikh. And this is my family, As-Salah family. According to our family records, we go back at least to the late 16th century. We don't know if before that what the history of the family was. Our history can also be traced in Haifa in the official Ottoman records dating back to the late 18th century, when Napoleon Bonaparte passed through the city on his way to conquer Acre or Akka. In March 1948, my grandparents Rabia and Lutfi As-Salah, along with their 3-year-old son Amin and Nasser, whom Rabia was still pregnant with, were forcibly expelled from Haifa as the city was being shelled by Zionist terrorist militias, and people were being shot in the streets by Zionist snipers. The following month, in April, the city was emptied by those Zionist terrorist militias, street by street, of its more than 50,000 Palestinian inhabitants. Many Palestinian homes in Haifa, especially in Wadi Nisnas, where the As-Salah family resided, are still empty and shuttered, waiting to be brought back to life by their rightful owners. In 1880, before the Zionist movement was established, there were approximately 25,000 Palestinian Jews living in Palestine. It is important and crucial to note that Jews have always been part of the societal fabric of Palestine and the Arab world. So Yemen's Jewish community, for example, was a thriving community. In Morocco, it's the same. In Iraq, in Baghdad, the approximately a third of the population was Jewish. And here you see a picture of Palestinian Jews in Jerusalem from 1895. So today there are still a few hundred indigenous Palestinian Jews living in the occupied West Bank, and they are treated as Palestinians by the Israeli occupation. Before Zionism, Arab Jews lived in peace and coexistence in their communities. While the majority of them were Arab natives, many of them originated from Spain and other parts of Europe. They were survivors of the Spanish Inquisition in the late 15th century and other European pogroms spanning centuries. In the narrative works of Palestinians in the early 20th century, native Palestinian Jews were often referred to and described as Abna al-Balad, which means sons of the country, or compatriots. They were also referred to as Yahud Awlad al-Arab, which means Jews, the sons of Arabs. So again, they were considered to be part and parcel of Palestinian society. So how it started. Palestine as a region developed long before Islam and Christianity. Indeed, proof exists of the place name, the toponym, which dates back as early as the 5th century BC. Herodotus, the father of history, outlined this region nearly to its present-day borders in his book, The Histories. Quoting from his book, "This nation, according to its own self-description, has long lived on the Red Sea where they still reside. This section of Syria and all of the areas extending from here until the border of Egypt is known by the name of Palestine. In the country extending from the land of the Phoenicians, modern-day Lebanon, to the borders of Gaza City live the Syrians who are called Palestinians. The place name Palestine," so this is the end of the quote. So as you can see, Herodotus describes the land as Palestine from the tip of the South Lebanon until the beginning of Egypt. And he talks about Gaza, and he describes them as Syrian Arabs who live in Palestine. The place name Palestine remained in use for thousands of years in thousands of maps and thousands of news articles up until 1948. So why did the name change to Israel? Next slide. In the 19th century, the ideologies of nationalism and social Darwinism took hold in Europe. European Jews who chose to break away from their religion and attempt to join the secular nationalist movements in their home countries were rejected by their co-nationalists. The majority of Europe's ruling classes considered the citizens who adhered to or descended from Jewish heritage to be a different race, and an inferior one at that. This was expressed in Europe as the Jewish question, which took on increasingly anti-Semitic tendencies towards the end of the 19th century. Zionism was one of many responses to the Jewish question. It advocated creating an independent state for Europe's Jews by colonizing Palestine. And so we see here the New York Times article from June 20th, 1899, about a conference of Zionists in Baltimore, and the subtitle reads, "Will Colonize Palestine." So from the outset, Zionism as a political ideology was all about colonization, which means to replace the indigenous population with one that immigrates from outside the region. Theodor Herzl was the founder of Zionism, and so rather than opposing anti-Semitism and fighting for Europe's Jews to gain minority rights, which is what other Jewish movements did, like the Bundists, the Socialists, the Communists, they were just a mix of all kinds of European compatriots. Zionism, however, considered anti-Semitism in Europe as, quote, a propelling force that aided the Zionist project. In the words of Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, everything depends on our propelling force. And what is our propelling force? The misery of the Jews. This is from the preface of his book, The Jewish State. Quote, the governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. This is from The Jewish State again. The first Zionist leaders did not shy away from describing their project as it is, a settler colonial project which aimed at replacing the native Palestinian population with European Jewish settlers. Quote, we shall try to spirit the penniless population in the colonized country across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our own country. This is from the Complete Diaries, June 12, 1895. And here we see another quote from the Complete Diaries. The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies. And indeed, this is what happened. Arthur Balfour here, who was the British Prime Minister in 1902 to 1905, at the time he introduced immigration controls for the first time in the United Kingdom, and one of the main objectives was to control Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, to prevent it. Balfour saw in Zionism not just a blessing for Jews, but for the West as well. As he wrote in 1919, the Zionist movement would, quote, mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body, he means European Jews, which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or to absorb. So this anti-Semite, Arthur Balfour, drafted the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was a treaty of alliance between Zionism and the foremost colonial power in the world at the time, the British Empire. In another instance, Balfour said, quote, we have to face the facts. Men are not born equal. The white and black races are not born with equal capacities. They are born with different capacities which education cannot and will not change. So clearly Balfour was a racist and an anti-Semite. And the Balfour Declaration basically is a statement where the British Empire promises to give a land already inhabited by a people, the Palestinian people, to a European minority which the British Empire perceived as a threat, and therefore chose to expel from Europe rather than integrate. And remarkably, Balfour himself was unabashedly aware of the hypocrisy entailed in conceding self-determination to one group but not another. In a letter to the British Prime Minister in 1919, he writes, the weak point of our position is that in the case of Palestine, we deliberately and rightly decline the principle of self-determination for Palestinians. We do not even go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. So how did the Palestinians respond? As early as 1922, we can discern the popular Palestinian position, a call for a single democratic state governed by all of Palestine's inhabitants. This is a quote from one of the statements issued by the Arab National Council in Palestine. We therefore here once again repeat that nothing will safeguard Arab interests in Palestine but the immediate creation of a national government which shall be responsible to a parliament of all whose members are elected by the people of the country, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Otherwise, we see division and tension between Arabs and Zionists increasing day by day and resulting in general retrogression. Another founding father of Zionism, or another key player, was Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was born in Russia, and he is the founding father of the current Likud party governed by Benjamin Netanyahu. Jabotinsky's ideology of expansionist Zionism was adopted by the Likud party, and Netanyahu's actual name, his family name is Mikhailowski, and he is originally from Poland. Netanyahu's father was the personal secretary of Jabotinsky. Fascism in the 1920s and 30s was popular among many Zionists, and Italy's Mussolini expressed support for Zionism, and Jabotinsky in particular. Quote from Mussolini, "For Zionism to succeed, you need to have a Jewish state with a Jewish flag and Jewish language. The person who understands that is your fascist," Jabotinsky. Mussolini collaborated with Hitler in World War II in rounding up Italian Jews and sending them off to perish in the Nazi death camps. A memoir by Italian Jewish writer Primo Levi, If This Is a Man, Survival in Auschwitz, is a testament to those horrors. And let's expand on the quotes in the slide here. Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. This colonization can therefore continue and develop only under the protection of a force independent of the local population, an iron wall which the native population cannot break through. This is in total our policy towards the Arabs. To formulate it any other way would only be hypocrisy. In another section he writes, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." This is the Iron Wall from 1923. And today, more than 100 years later, this is between January and April of 2025, Netanyahu's government is conducted a military assault in the occupied West Bank, where more than 40,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the Jenin refugee camp. And this military operation was dubbed Iron Wall. For many years before 1947, European Jews were prevented from immigrating to Britain, Canada, and the United States. European Jews escaping the horrors of Europe's anti-Semitism were funneled by racist immigration policies, such as the one set by Balfour in the United Kingdom, into Palestine. The Zionist movement collaborated with Europe's governments in such endeavors as of controlled immigration, and its leaders disapproved when Jewish lives were saved otherwise. For example, a month after the Nazi pogrom against Germany's Jews, famously known as Kristallnacht, Britain saved 10,000 Jewish children by providing them an escape into the UK. David Ben-Gurion, later to be the first Prime Minister of Israel, stated in December 1938, a month after the pogrom, quote, "If I knew it was possible to save all Jewish children of Germany by their transfer to England, and only half of them by transferring them to Eretz Israel, I would choose the latter, because we are faced not only with the accounting of these Jewish children, but also with the historical accounting of the Jewish people." This is from his book, Righteous Victims, page 162. In less than 5 years, the Jewish population in Palestine had doubled, and despite that, by 1947, less than a third of the population in Palestine were Jewish settlers from Europe, and they owned less than 7% of the land. The United Nations, against the will of the Palestinian people, proposed a plan which was architected by a Canadian Supreme Court Judge Lester Pearson. This plan was to divide the country in half when the majority of the population and land ownership fell clearly in Palestinians' favor. The Palestinian demand before 1947 until today was one democratic state where all inhabitants of the land are equal citizens under the law. This was expressed in the UN at the time in the report issued by what was called the Second Subcommittee. But the newly established international order, under the hegemony of the United States and under the influence of the Zionist lobby, did not heed the Palestinian call for true democracy. And you can read more about this in Ilan Pappé's book, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic. So, as we said, it wasn't Lester Pearson, it was the Supreme Court of Justice, Ivan C. Rand, who was a central figure in drafting the UN report which proposed partition. Lester B. Pearson, which was then a senior Canadian diplomat and later the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, became the chairman of the UN subcommittee responsible for drawing up the detailed plan of partition. And he played a pivotal role in securing a compromise in support of partition at the UN General Assembly in November 1947. In fact, Zionists so appreciated Pearson's and Rand's role that they called Pearson the Balfour of Canada, and they established the Ivan C. Rand Chair of Law at the Hebrew University in occupied Jerusalem. And so, from 1947, as soon as this partition plan was declared, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began. It was documented by the Israeli military archives, which were detailed in Israeli historian Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. In a speech addressing the Zionist Action Committee on April 6, 1948, Ben-Gurion stated that war could be used as an instrument to solve the so-called Arab demographic problem. He said, quote, "We will not be able to win the war if we do not, during the war, populate the Galilee, the Negev, and Jerusalem area, even if only in an artificial way, in a military way. I believe that war will also bring in its wake a great change in the distribution of the Palestinian Arab population." Between November 1947 and May 1948, more than 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, more than 500 villages were destroyed, and more than 20 cities and towns were emptied of their Palestinian inhabitants, including the one of my grandfather and grandmother, Haifa. Soon after Haifa's collapse and the flight of its Palestinian inhabitants in late April 1948, Ben-Gurion stated that Haifa was like, quote, "a dead city, a corpse city, a horrifying and fantastic sight." But in this campaign of ethnic cleansing, Ben-Gurion saw positives for the Zionist project. Quote, "What happened in Haifa can happen in other parts of the country if we will hold out. It may be that in the next 6 or 8 months of the campaign, there will be great changes in the country, and not to our detriment. Certainly there will be great changes in the composition of the population of the country." One other prominent Jew, Albert Einstein, was asked to show his support for the Zionist project. In a letter to the American Friends of the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, dated April 10, 1948, this is what Einstein said: "When a real and final catastrophe should befall us in Palestine, the first responsible for it would be the British, and the second responsible for it, the terrorist organizations built up from our own," he means the European Jewish, "ranks. I am not willing to see anybody associated with those misled and criminal people." So this brings us to the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, the total area of the Gaza Strip is 365 square kilometers, about half of the greater Victoria region. Its population is 2.2 million people, which is 6 times the greater Victoria population. So it is 12 times as densely populated as the greater Victoria region at 5,500 people per square kilometer. 85,000 bombs, 85,000 tons of explosives were dropped on Gaza between October 2023 and January 2025. That is the equivalent of 6 nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima in World War II. It is also worth noting that 80% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are not originally from Gaza, but were displaced from their towns and villages during the Nakba in 1948. They live in refugee camps spread across the Strip, relying on UNRWA, the United Nations schools for education, and UN clinics for healthcare. And since 2007, the Israeli occupation has put Gaza under a deadly siege from all sides, controlling everything. The blockade severely restricts the movement of people, goods, and services in and out of Gaza, leading to widespread economic hardship, limited access to healthcare, and a humanitarian crisis. Israel counted the population and set the amount of food coming in according to an above-starvation diet. It gave Gaza the description of the biggest open-air prison. And there were multiple attacks on Gaza, each of which resulted in the killing by the Israeli military of thousands of civilians. And the most recent onslaught, which began in 2023, October, displaced 2 million Gazans, killed at least, this is from April 2025, 47,000 people, including 17,500 children, but now the numbers are much higher. And this presentation is being recorded in July or June 30th, 2025, with more than 10,000 people missing and more than 100,000 people injured. 92% of the housing units were damaged, 80% of commercial facilities were damaged, 68% of the cropland area was damaged, 50% of the hospitals are barely functional, 70% of the road networks were damaged, 88% of school buildings were damaged. And so in last year, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. However, these warrants have not been executed because Israel is not a party to the ICC and does not recognize its jurisdiction. Legally, when individuals with ICC warrants travel to countries who are members of the Rome Statute, they are supposed to be arrested and handed over to the court. Surprisingly, this has not been enforced, as evidenced by Gallant traveling freely to the United States without any action being taken against him. The same thing for Netanyahu. War crimes that Israel committed in this genocide is forced displacement, engineering a humanitarian catastrophe by enforcing a medieval siege of mass starvation, attacks on medical facilities and healthcare workers and journalists, sexual violence where reports document rape and other forms of violence committed by Israeli forces against Palestinian women, children, and men in Israeli prisons, and more than 217 Palestinians who are journalists who have been killed in the conflict, in the genocide. So Israel, the state of Israel, de facto controls all of historical Palestine today. It is a multifaceted system where Palestinians, depending on their location, are treated in a variety of discriminatory ways. For example, the 2 million Palestinians in Israel proper who carry Israeli citizenship are treated as second-class citizens. They cannot own property on 85% of their homeland. And in 2018, Israel issued the Jewish state law depriving them any right to self-determination. And this is only two quick examples of how they are discriminated against. There's more than 31 laws documented by Al-Haq, which is a legal advocacy group in occupied Palestine, which details all the laws, the Israeli laws that discriminate against Palestinians in so-called Israel proper. In East Jerusalem, tens of thousands of Palestinians are treated as illegal squatters on their own land, in their own homes. And so demolitions, evictions are happening on a daily basis. The same thing in the occupied West Bank, where 3 million Palestinians have no legal status under Israeli military occupation. They live under a system of endless military checkpoints, searches, arbitrary military detention, arbitrary night raids into their own homes, and at the same time, Jewish settlers continue to usurp their land and attack their villages and populations. And the worst form of apartheid and discrimination and violence is in the Gaza Strip, where 2 million Palestinians have been economically besieged for more than 17 years. And in the past 15 or 20 months, their whole cities and towns have been systematically destroyed, their lives made expendable, with more, now reports talk about more than 100,000 killed, anywhere between 100 and 400,000, because, again, the journalists are prevented from entering the Gaza Strip, and the medical healthcare system has collapsed, so it is very difficult to estimate exactly the number of people killed, but it is at least 60,000, the majority of whom are women and children. And finally, the 7 million diaspora Palestinians, of which I am one, are forbidden to return to their homeland or even visit simply because they are Palestinian. This is a video that summarizes the vision for Palestinian liberation. I'm not sure it will show up as I record this presentation, but basically two Palestinians, prominent Palestinian figures, talk about the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea as establishing a democratic state where the rule of law is established for all its inhabitants, where Palestinians or descendants of Palestinians who are in diaspora can return, and where people who committed war crimes are brought to justice, and the people who did not commit war crimes are left to live in safety and freedom in Palestine. Here, this video highlights a visit in January 2025 of Chief Reuben George of the Tzlel Watuth Nation, giving a speech connecting the indigenous struggles from Turtle Island to Palestine. And this is one way in which people can show their support is by attending the rallies, the weekly rallies that we hold in the legislature building every Saturday in downtown Victoria to show support for Palestine, to speak up about the interconnectedness of the indigenous struggles from Turtle Island, or so-called North America, to Palestine. Canada's complicity in the genocide. So how Canadian citizens need to be aware that they are complicit in the genocide happening in Palestine. And all of this information can be found in this link, Palestine Uncovered. The Canadian pension plan invests $16 billion in companies associated with illegal occupation and war crimes. The Canada Revenue Agency subsidizes so-called charities funneling money to illegal settlements in the West Bank. CBC management policy obfuscates Israeli crimes and Palestinian lived experience of the horrors of the genocide in Gaza. Canadian factories on Canadian soil manufacture F-35 fighter jet essential components, bombs, and other munitions, then exports them via the US to Israel without any legal oversight. Canadian mainstream media has not interviewed any of the Canadian healthcare workers who have been to Gaza, witnessed firsthand Israeli war crimes, and signed a letter calling on the Canadian government to impose an arms embargo on Israel. So what can you do? You can attend your local rally to show support. You can refrain from purchasing products or services that benefit the Israeli occupation. Two phone apps, one called No Thanks, the other called Boycott. Make it very easy to do this while you're shopping. You can contact your MP in Ottawa and demand that Canada impose sanctions on Israel until illegal occupation, apartheid, and war crimes come to an end. International sanctions were an important factor in ending the apartheid regime in South Africa. You can follow alternative media and independent investigative journalists to get unfiltered news and keep yourself informed. And there's a link tree here, Return to Palestine, which gives you a lot of those media and news sources. The Palestinians continue to resist. They continue to clean up and dust themselves off of the rubble after, as the genocide keeps going. They keep dancing, they keep embroidering, they keep planting olive trees again and again and again, even after Israel has burned more than 500,000 olive trees since the illegal occupation began in 1948. We have provided here sources and further readings, and we have also our sources about Canada's complicity. And thank you if you've reached here so far. Palestine has been suffering for more than 100 years. We count on you to help us to end the violence and the bloodshed and bring in justice and peace. As Ashira, who is a character in one of the films called Where...
Hi, Baba.
Okay, we have to end it here.
Hi, Baba. Hi.